5 or 6 of the Falkland sailors did, however, murmur a little. A sign from the mate silenced them, and they returned at once to their posts. Needless to say, Captain Len Guy, upon hearing the cry of the lookout man, had tumbled up from his cabin and eagerly examined this land at 10 or 12 miles distance. As I have said, I was no longer thinking about the secret Dirk Peters had confided to me. Besides, so long as the secret remained between us two, and neither would betray it, there would be nothing to fear. But if ever an unlucky accident were to reveal to Martin Holt that his brother's name had been changed to Parker, that the unfortunate man had not perished in the shipwreck of the Grampus, but had been sacrificed to save his companions from perishing of hunger, that Dirk Peters, to whom Martin Holt himself owed his life, had killed him with his own hand, what might not happen then? This was the reason why the half-breed shrank from any expression of thanks from Martin Holt, why he avoided Martin Holt, the victim's brother. The boatswain had just struck 6 bells. The schooner was sailing with the caution demanded by navigation in unknown seas. There might be shoals or reefs barely hidden under the surface on which she might run aground or be wrecked. As things stood with the Halbrane, and even admitting that she could be floated again, an accident would have rendered her return impossible before the winter set in. We had urgent need that every chance should be in our favor and not one against us. West had given orders to shorten sail. When the boatswain had furled the top-gallant sail, the topsail and royal, the Halbrane remained under her mainsail, her foresail and her jib, sufficient canvas to cover the distance that separated her from land in a few hours. Captain Len Guy immediately heaved the lead, which showed a depth of 20 fathoms. Several other soundings showed that the coast, which was very steep, was probably prolonged like a wall under the water. Nevertheless, as the bottom might happen to rise sharply instead of following the slope of the coast, we did not venture to proceed without the sounding line in hand. The weather was still beautiful, although the sky was overcast by a mist from southeast to southwest. Owing to this, there was some difficulty in identifying the vague outlines which stood out like floating vapor in the sky, disappearing, and then reappearing between the breaks of the mist. However, we all agreed to regard this land as being from 25 to 30 fathoms in height, at least at its highest part. No, we would not admit that we were the victims of a delusion, and yet our uneasy minds feared that it might be so. Is it not natural, after all, for the heart to be assailed by 1,000 apprehensions as we near the end of any enterprise? At this thought my mind became confused and dreamy. The Halbrane seemed to be reduced to the dimensions of a small boat lost in this boundless space, the contrary of that limitless sea of which Edgar Poe speaks, where, like a living body, the ship grows larger. When we have charts, or even sailing directions to instruct us concerning the hydrography of the coasts, the nature of the landfalls, the bays and the creeks, we may sail along boldly. In every other region, the master of a ship must not defer the order to cast anchor near the shore until the morrow. But where we were, what an amount of prudence was necessary. And yet, no manifest obstacle was before us. Moreover, we had no cause to fear that the light would fail us during the sunny hours of the night. At this season, the sun did not set so soon under the western horizon, and its rays bathed the vast Antarctic zone in unabated light. From that day forward, the ship's log recorded that the temperature fell continuously. The thermometer in the air and in the shade did not mark more than 32 degrees, 0 degrees C, and when plunged into water, it only indicate degrees, 3 degrees 33 letter 2b9c below 0 degrees. What could be the cause of this fall, since we were at the height of the southern summer? The crew were obliged to resume their woolen clothing, which they had left off a month previously. The schooner, however, was sailing before the wind, and these first cold blasts were less keenly felt, yet we recognized the necessity of reaching our goal as soon as possible. To linger in this region, or to expose ourselves to the danger of wintering out would be to tempt Providence. Captain Len Guy tested the direction of the current repeatedly by heavy lead lines, and discovered that it was beginning to deviate from its former course. Whether it is a continent, said he, that lies before us, or whether it is an island, we have at present no means of determining. If it be a continent, we must conclude that the current has an issue towards the southeast. And it is quite possible, I replied, that the solid part of the Antarctic region may be reduced to a mere polar mound. In any case, it is well to note any of those observations which are likely to be accurate. That is just what I am doing, Mr. Georling, and we shall bring back a mass of information about this portion of the Southern Sea which will prove useful to navigators. If ever any venture to come so far south, Captain, we have penetrated so far, thanks to the help of particular circumstances, the earliness of the summer season, an abnormal temperature, and a rapid thaw. Such conditions may only occur once in 20 or 50 years. Wherefore, Mr. Georling, I thank Providence for this, and hope revives in me to some extent. As the weather has been constantly fine, what is there to make it impossible for my brother and my fellow countrymen to have landed on this coast, whither the wind and the tide bore them? What our schooner has done, their boat may have done. They surely did not start on a voyage which might be prolonged to an indefinite time without a proper supply of provisions. Why should they not have found the resources as those afforded to them by the island of Tsallel during many long years? They had ammunition and arms elsewhere. Fish abound in these waters, waterfowl also. Oh yes, my heart is full of hope, and I wish I were a few hours older. Without being quite so sanguine as Len Guy, I was glad to see he had regained his hopeful mood. Perhaps, if his investigations were successful, I might be able to have them continued in Arthur Pym's interest, even into the heart of this strange land which we were approaching. The Halbrane was going along slowly on these clear waters, which swarmed with fish belonging to the same species as we had already met. The sea-birds were more numerous, and were evidently not frightened, for they kept flying round the mast, or perching in the yards. Several whitish ropes about 5 or 6 feet long were brought on board. They were chaplets formed of millions of pearly shellfish. Whales, spouting jets of feathery water from their blowholes, appeared at a distance, and I remarked that all of them took a southerly direction. There was therefore reason to believe that the sea extended far and wide in that direction. The schooner covered 2 or 3 miles of her course without any increase of speed. This coast evidently stretched from northwest to southeast. Nevertheless, the telescopes revealed no distinctive features, even after 3 hours' navigation. The crew, gathered together on the forecastle, were looking on without revealing their impressions. West, after going aloft to the forecross trees, where he had remained 10 minutes, had reported nothing precise. Stationed at the port side, leaning my elbows on the bulwarks, I closely watched the sky line, broken only towards the east. At this moment the boatswain rejoined me, and without preface said, "Will you allow me to give you my opinion, Mr. Georling?" "Give it, boatswain," I replied, "at the risk of my not adopting it if I don't agree with it." "It is correct, and according as we get nearer one must really be blind not to adopt it." "And what idea have you got?" "That it is not land which lies before us, Mr. Georling." "What is it you are saying?" "Look attentively, putting one finger before your eyes. Look there, out a starboard." I did as Hurlegerly directed. "Do you see?" he began again. "May I lose my liking for my grog if these heights do not change place, not with regard to the schooner, but with regard to themselves." "And what do you conclude from this?" "That they are moving icebergs." "Icebergs!" "Sure enough, Mr. Georling. Was not the boatswain mistaken? Were we in for a disappointment? Were there only drifting ice mountains in the distance instead of a shore?" Presently, there was no doubt on the subject. For some time past the crew had no longer believed in the existence of land in that direction. 10 minutes afterwards, the man in the crow's nest announced that several icebergs were coming from the northwest, in an oblique direction, into the course of the Halbrane. This news produced a great sensation on board. Our last hope was suddenly extinguished. And what a blow to Captain Len Guy! We should have to seek this land of the austral zone under higher latitudes without being sure of ever coming across it. And then the cry, back ship," resounded almost unanimously on board the Halbrane. Yes, indeed, the recruits from the Falklands were demanding that we should turn back, although Hearn was not there to fan the flame of insubordination, and I must acknowledge that the greater part of the old tars seemed to agree with them. West awaited his chief's orders, not daring to impose silence. Gratian was at the helm, ready to give a turn to the wheel, whilst his comrades with their hands on the cleats were preparing to ease off the sheets. Dirk Peters remained immovable, leaning against the foremast, his head down, his body bent, and his mouth set firm. Not a word passed his lips. But now he turned towards me, and what a look of mingled wrath and entreaty he gave me. I don't know what irresistible motive induced me to interfere personally, and once again to protest. A final argument had just crossed my mind, an argument whose weight could not be disputed. So I began to speak, and I did so with such conviction that none tried to interrupt me. The substance of what I said was as follows. No, all hope must not be abandoned. Land cannot be far off. The icebergs which are formed in the open sea by the accumulation of ice are not before us. These icebergs must have broken off from the solid base of a continent or an island. Now, since the thaw begins at this season of the year, the drift will last for only a short time. Behind them we must meet the coast on which they were formed. In another 24 hours, or 48 at the most, if the land does not appear, Captain Len Guy will steer to the north again. Had I convinced the crew, or ought I to take advantage of Hearn's absence, and of the fact that he could not communicate with them, to make them understand that they were being deceived, and to repeat to them that it would endanger the schooner if our course were now to be reversed? The boatswain came to my help, and in a good-humored voice exclaimed, "Very well reasoned, and for my part I accept Mr. Georling's opinion. Assuredly, land is near. If we seek it beyond those icebergs, we shall discover it without much hard work or great danger. What is 1 degree farther south, when it is a question of putting $100 additional into one's pocket? And let us not forget that if they are acceptable when they go in, they are none the less so when they come out." Upon this, Endicott, the cook, came to the aid of his friend the boatswain. "Yes, very good things indeed are dollars," cried he, showing 2 rows of shining white teeth. Chapter 999. The crew intend to yield to Hurliguerly's argument, or would they try to resist if the Halbrane went on in the direction of the icebergs? Captain Len Guy took up his telescope again and turned it upon these moving masses. He observed them with much attention and cried out in a loud voice, "Steer south-southwest." West gave orders to execute the maneuvers. The sailors hesitated an instant. Then, recalled to obedience, they began to brace the yards and slack the sheets, and the schooner increased her speed. When the operation was over, I went up to Hurliguerly, and drawing him aside, I said, "Thank you, boatswain." "Ah, Mr. Georling," he replied, shaking his head, "it is all very fine for this time, but you must not do it again. Everyone would turn against me, even Endicott perhaps." "I have urged nothing which is not at least probable," I answered sharply. "I don't deny that fact, Mr. Georling." "Yes, Hurliguerly, yes, I believe what I have said, and I have no doubt but that we shall really see the land beyond the icebergs." "Just possible, Mr. Georling, quite possible. But it must appear before 2 days, or, on the word of a boatswain, nothing can prevent us from putting about." During the next 24 hours the Halbrane took a south-southwesterly course. Nevertheless, her direction must have been frequently changed, and her speed decreased in avoiding the ice. The navigation became very difficult so soon as the schooner headed towards the line of the bergs, which it had to cut obliquely. However, there were none of the packs which blocked up all access to the iceberg on the 67th parallel. The enormous heaps were melting away with majestic slowness. The ice blocks appeared quite new, to employ a perfectly accurate expression, and perhaps they had only been formed some days. However, with a height of 150 feet, their bulk must have been calculated by millions of tons. West was watching closely in order to avoid collisions, and did not leave the deck even for an instant. Until now, Captain Len Guy had always been able to rely upon the indications of the compass. The magnetic pole, still hundreds of miles off, had no influence on the compass, its direction being east. The needle remained steady and might be trusted. So, in spite of my conviction, founded, however, on very serious arguments, there was no sign of land, and I was wondering whether it would not be better to steer more to the west, at the risk of removing the Halbrane from that extreme point where the meridians of the globe cross each other. Thus, as the hours went by, and I was only allowed 48, it was only too plain that lack of courage prevailed, and that everyone was inclined to be insubordinate. After another day and a half, I could no longer contend with the general discontent. The schooner must ultimately retrace her course towards the north. The crew were working in silence, whilst West was giving sharp, short orders for maneuvering through the channels, sometimes luffing in order to avoid a collision, now bearing away almost square before the wind. Nevertheless, in spite of a close watch, in spite of the skill of the sailors, in spite of the prompt execution of the maneuvers, dangerous friction against the hull, which left long traces of the ridge of the icebergs, occurred. And in truth, the bravest could not repress a feeling of terror when thinking that the planking might have given way and the sea have invaded us. The base of these floating ice mountains was very steep, so that it would have been impossible for us to land upon one. Moreover, we saw no seals. These were usually very numerous where the ice fields abounded, nor even a flock of the screeching penguins which, on other occasions, the Halbrane sent diving by myriads as she passed through them. The birds themselves seemed rarer and wilder. Dread, from which none of us could escape, seemed to come upon us from these desolate and deserted regions. How could we still entertain a hope that the survivors of the Jane had found shelter and obtained means of existence in those awful solitudes? And if the Halbrane were also shipwrecked, would there remain any evidence of her fate? Since the previous day, from the moment our southern course had been abandoned, to cut the line of the icebergs, a change had taken place in the demeanor of the half-breed. Nearly always crouched down at the foot of the foremast, looking afar into the boundless space, he only got up in order to lend a hand to some maneuver, and without any of his former vigilance or zeal. Not that he had ceased to believe that his comrade of the Jane was still living, that thought never even came into his mind. But he felt by instinct that the traces of poor Pym were not to be recovered by following this course. "Sir," he would have said to me, "this is not the way, no, this is not the way." And how could I have answered him? Towards 7 o'clock in the evening, a rather thick mist arose. This would tend to make the navigation of the schooner difficult and dangerous. The day, with its emotions of anxiety and alternatives, had worn me out. So I returned to my cabin, where I threw myself on my bunk in my clothes. But sleep did not come to me, owing to my besetting thoughts. I willingly admit that the constant reading of Edgar Poe's works, and reading them in this place in which his heroes delighted, had exercised an influence on me which I did not fully recognize. Tomorrow, the 48 hours would be up, the last concession which the crew had made to my entreaties. "Things are not going as you wish," the boatswain said to me just as I was leaving the deck. No, certainly not, since land was not to be seen behind the fleet of icebergs. If no sign of a coast appeared between these moving masses, Captain Len Guy would steer north tomorrow. Ah, were I only master of the schooner! If I could have bought it even at the price of all my fortune, if these men had been my slaves to drive by the lash, the Halbrane should never have given up this voyage, even if it led her so far as the point above which flames the Southern Cross. My mind was quite upset, and teemed with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 regrets, 1,000 desires. I wanted to get up, but a heavy hand held me down in my bunk, and I longed to leave this cabin where I was struggling against nightmare in my half-sleep, to launch one of the boats of the Halbrane, to jump into it with Dirk Peters, who would not hesitate about following me, and so abandon both of us to the current running south. And lo, I was doing this in a dream. It is tomorrow. Captain Len Guy has given orders to reverse our course after a last glance at the horizon. One of the boats is in tow. I warn the half-breed. We creep along without being seen. We cut the painter. Whilst the schooner sails on ahead, we stay astern and the current carries us off. Thus we drift on the sea without hindrance. At length our boat stops. Land is there. I see a sort of sphinx surmounting the southern peak, the sea sphinx. I go to him. I question him. He discloses the secrets of these mysterious regions to me, and then, the phenomena whose reality Arthur Pym asserted appear around the mythic monster. The curtain of flickering vapors, striped with luminous rays, is rent asunder. And it is not a face of superhuman grandeur which arises before my astonished eyes. It is Arthur Pym, fierce guardian of the South Pole, flaunting the ensign of the United States in those high latitudes. Was this dream suddenly interrupted, or was it changed by a freak of my brain? I cannot tell, but I felt as though I had been suddenly awakened. It seemed as though a change had taken place in the motion of the schooner, which was sliding along on the surface of the quiet sea, with a slight list to starboard. And yet there was neither rolling nor pitching. Yes, I felt myself carried off as though my bunk were the car of an air balloon. I was not mistaken, and I had fallen from dreamland into reality. Crash succeeded crash overhead. I could not account for them. Inside my cabin, the partitions deviated from the vertical in such a way as to make one believe that the Halbrane had fallen over on her beam ends. Almost immediately, I was thrown out of my bunk and barely escaped splitting my skull against the corner of the table. However, I got up again, and clinging on to the edge of the door frame, I propped myself against the door. At this instant, the bulwarks began to crack, and the port side of the ship was torn open. Could there have been a collision between the schooner and one of those gigantic floating masses, which West was unable to avoid in the mist? Suddenly loud shouts came from the afterdeck, and then screams of terror, in which the maddened voices of the crew joined. At length there came a final crash, and the Halbrane remained motionless. I had to crawl along the floor to reach the door and gain the deck. Captain Lenguy, having already left his cabin, dragged himself on his knees, so great was the list to port, and caught on as best he could. In the forepart of the ship, between the forecastle and the foremast, many heads appeared. Dirk Peters, Hardy, Martin Holt, and Endicott, the latter with his black face quite vacant, were clinging to the starboard shrouds. A man came creeping up to me, because the slope of the deck prevented him from holding himself upright. It was Hurlegerly, working himself along with his hands like a topman on a yard. Stretched out at full length, my feet propped up against the jamb of the door, I held out my hand to the boatswain, and helped him, not without difficulty, to hoist himself up near me. "What is wrong?" I asked. "A stranding, Mr. Georling. We are ashore." "Ashore presupposes land," replied the boatswain ironically, "and so far as land goes, there was never any except in that rascal Dirk Peters' imagination. But tell me, what has happened?" "We came upon an iceberg in the middle of the fog, and were unable to keep clear of it." "An iceberg, boatswain?" "Yes, an iceberg, which has chosen just now to turn head over heels. In turning, it struck the Halbrane and carried it off just as a battledore catches a shuttlecock, and now here we are, stranded at certainly 100 feet above the level of the Antarctic Sea." Could one have imagined a more terrible conclusion to the adventurous voyage of the Halbrane? In the middle of these remote regions, our only means of transport had just been snatched from its natural element, and carried off by the turn of an iceberg to a height of more than 100 feet. What a conclusion! To be swallowed up in a polar tempest, to be destroyed in a fight with savages, to be crushed in the ice, such are the dangers to which any ship engaged in the polar seas is exposed. But to think that the Halbrane had been lifted by a floating mountain just as that mountain was turning over, was stranded and almost at its summit. No, such a thing seemed quite impossible. I did not know whether we could succeed in letting down the schooner from this height, with the means we had at our disposal, but I did know that Captain Lenguy, the mate, and the older members of the crew, when they had recovered from their first fright, would not give up in despair, no matter how terrible the situation might be. Of that I had no doubt whatsoever. They would all look to the general safety. As for the measures to be taken, no one yet knew anything. A foggy veil, a sort of grayish mist, still hung over the iceberg. Nothing could be seen of its enormous mass except the narrow, craggy cleft in which the schooner was wedged, nor even what place it occupied in the middle of the ice fleet drifting towards the southeast. Common prudence demanded that we should quit the Halbrane, which might slide down at a sharp shake of the iceberg. Were we even certain that the latter had regained its position on the surface of the sea? Was her stability secure? Should we not be on the lookout for a fresh upheaval? And if the schooner were to fall into the abyss, which of us could extricate himself safe and sound from such a fall, and then from the final plunge into the depths of the ocean? In a few minutes the crew had abandoned the Halbrane. Each man sought for refuge on the ice slopes, awaiting the time when the iceberg should be freed from mist. The oblique rays from the sun did not succeed in piercing it, and the red disk could hardly be perceived through the opaque mass. However, we could distinguish each other at about 12 feet apart. As for the Halbrane, she looked like a confused blackish mass, standing out sharply against the whiteness of the ice. We had now to ascertain whether any of those who were on the deck at the time of the catastrophe had been thrown over the bulwarks and precipitated into the sea. By Captain Lenguy's orders, all the sailors then present joined the group in which I stood with the mate, the boatswain, Hardy, and Martin Holt. So far, this catastrophe had cost us 5 men. These were the first since our departure from Kerguelen, but were they to be the last? There was no doubt that these unfortunate fellows had perished, because we called them in vain, and in vain we sought for them, when the fog abated, along the sides of the iceberg, at every place where they might have been able to catch on to a projection. When the disappearance of the 5 men had been ascertained, we fell into despair. Then we felt more keenly than before the dangers which threaten every expedition to the Antarctic zone. "What about Hearn?" said a voice. Martin Holt pronounced the name at a moment when there was general silence. Had the sealing master been crushed to death in the narrow part of the hold where he was shut up? "The Halbrand fast in the iceberg." "The Halbrand fast in the iceberg." West rushed towards the schooner, hoisted himself on board by means of a rope hanging over the bows, and gained the hatch which gives access to that part of the hold. We waited silent and motionless to learn the fate of Hearn, although the evil spirit of the crew was but little worthy of our pity. And yet, how many of us were then thinking that if we had heeded his advice, and if the schooner had taken the northern course, a whole crew would not have been reduced to take refuge on a drifting ice mountain. I scarcely dared to calculate my own share of the vast responsibility, I who had so vehemently insisted on the prolongation of the voyage. At length the mate reappeared on deck and Hearn followed him. By a miracle, neither the bulkheads, nor the ribs, nor the planking had yielded at the place where the sealing master was confined. Hearn rejoined his comrades without opening his lips, and we had no further trouble about him. Towards 6 o'clock in the morning, the fog cleared off, owing to a marked fall in the temperature. We had no longer to do with completely frozen vapor, but had to deal with the phenomenon called frostrime, which often occurs in these high latitudes. Captain Len Guy recognized it by the quantity of prismatic threads, the point following the wind, which roughened the light ice crust deposited on the sides of the iceberg. Navigators know better than to confound this frostrime with the hoar frost of the temperate zones, which only freezes when it has been deposited on the surface of the soil. We were now enabled to estimate the size of the solid mass on which we clustered like flies on a sugar loaf, and the schooner, seen from below, looked no bigger than the yawl of a trading vessel. This iceberg of between 300 and 400 fathoms in circumference measured to 140 feet high. According to all calculations, therefore, its depth would be 4 or 5 times greater, and it would consequently weigh millions of tons. This is what had happened. The iceberg, having been melted away at its base by contact with warmer waters, had risen little by little. Its center of gravity had become displaced, and its equilibrium could only be re-established by a sudden capsize, which had lifted up the part that had been underneath above the sea level. The Halbrane, caught in this movement, was hoisted as by an enormous lever. Numbers of icebergs capsize thus on the polar seas, and form one of the greatest dangers to which approaching vessels are exposed. Our schooner was caught in a hollow on the west side of the iceberg. She listed to starboard with her stern raised and her bow lowered. We could not help thinking that the slightest shake would cause her to slide along the slope of the iceberg into the sea. The collision had been so violent as to stave in some of the planks of her hull. After the first collision, the galley situated before the foremast had broken its fastenings. The door between Captain Len Guy's and the mate's cabins was torn away from the hinges. The topmast and the topgallant mast had come down after the backstays parted, and fresh fractures could plainly be seen as high as the cap of the masthead. Fragments of all kinds, yards, spars, a part of the sails, breakers, cases, hencoops, were probably floating at the foot of the mass and drifting with it. The most alarming part of our situation was the fact that of the 2 boats belonging to the Halbrane, one had been stove in when we grounded, and the other, the larger of the 2, was still hanging on by its tackles to the starboard davits. Before anything else was done, this boat had to be put in a safe place, because it might prove our only means of escape. As a result of the first examination, we found that the lower masts had remained in their places, and might be of use if ever we succeeded in releasing the schooner. But how were we to release her from her bed in the ice, and restore her to her natural element? When I found myself with Captain Len Guy, the mate, and the boatswain, I questioned them on this subject. "I agree with you," replied West, "that the operation involves great risks, but since it is indispensable, we will accomplish it. I think it will be necessary to dig out a sort of slide down to the base of the iceberg." "And without the delay of a single day," added Captain Len Guy. "Do you hear, boatswain?" said Jem West. "Work begins today." "I hear, and everyone will set himself to the task," replied Hurl eagerly. If you allow me, I shall just make one observation, Captain. What is it? Before beginning the work, let us examine the hull and see what the damage is, and whether it can be repaired. For what use would it be to launch a ship stripped of her planks, which would go to the bottom at once? We complied with the boatswain's just demand. The fog having cleared off, a bright sun then illumined the eastern side of the iceberg, whence the sea was visible round a large part of the horizon. Here the sides of the iceberg showed rugged projections, ledges, shoulders, and even flat instead of smooth surfaces, giving no foothold. However, caution would be necessary in order to avoid the falling of those unbalanced blocks, which a single shock might set loose. And as a matter of fact, during the morning, several of these blocks did roll into the sea with a frightful noise just like an avalanche. On the whole, the iceberg seemed to be very steady on its new base. So long as the center of gravity was below the level of the waterline, there was no fear of a fresh capsize. I had not yet had an opportunity of speaking to Dirk Peters since the catastrophe. As he had answered to his name, I knew he was not numbered among the victims. At this moment, I perceived him standing on a narrow projection, needless to specify the direction in which his eyes were turned. Captain Len Guy, the mate, the boatswain, Hardy, and Martin Holt, whom I accompanied, went up again towards the schooner in order to make a minute investigation of the hull. On the starboard side, the operation would be easy enough, because the Halbrane had a list to the opposite side. On the port side, we would have to slide along to the keel as well as we could by scooping out the ice, in order to ensure the inspection of every part of the planking. After an examination which lasted 2 hours, it was discovered that the damage was of little importance and could be repaired in a short time. 2 or 3 planks only were wrenched away by the collision. In the inside the skin was intact, the ribs not having given way. Our vessel, constructed for the polar seas, had resisted where many others less solidly built would have been dashed to pieces. The rudder had indeed been unshipped, but that could easily be set right. Having finished our inspection inside and outside, we agreed that the damage was less considerable than we feared, and on that subject we became reassured. Reassured, yes, if we could only succeed in getting the schooner afloat again. Chapter 20. Unmerciful Disaster. In the morning, after breakfast, it was decided that the men should begin to dig a sloping bed which would allow the Halbrane to slide to the foot of the iceberg. Would that heaven might grant success to the operation, for who could contemplate without terror having to brave the severity of the austral winter, and to pass 6 months under such conditions as ours on a vast iceberg, dragged none could tell whither. Once the winter had set in, none of us could have escaped from that most terrible of fates, dying of cold. At this moment, Dirk Peters, who was observing the horizon from south to east at about 100 paces off, cried out in a rough voice, "Lying to." Lying to, what could the half-breed mean by that, except that the floating mass had suddenly ceased to drift? As for the cause of this stoppage, it was neither the moment to investigate it, nor to ask ourselves what the consequences were likely to be. "It is true, however," cried the boatswain, "the iceberg is not stirring, and perhaps has not stirred since it capsized." "How," said I, "it no longer changes its place?" "No," replied the mate, "and the proof is that the others, drifting on, are leaving it behind." And in fact, whilst 5 or 6 icebergs were descending towards the south, ours was as motionless as though it had been stranded on a shoal. The simplest explanation was that the new base had encountered ground at the bottom of the sea to which it now adhered, and would continue to adhere, unless the submerged part rose in the water so as to cause a second capsize. This complicated matters seriously, because the dangers of positive immobility were such that the chances of drifting were preferable. At least, in the latter case, there was some hope of coming across a continent or an island, or even, if the currents did not change, of crossing the boundaries of the austral region. Here we were then, after 3 months of this terrible voyage. Was there now any question of trying to save William Guy, his comrades on the Jane, and Arthur Pym? Was it not for our own safety that any means at our disposal should be employed? And could it be wondered at were the sailors of the Halbrane to rebel, were they to listen to Hearne's suggestions, and make their officers, or myself especially, responsible for the disasters of this expedition? Moreover, what was likely to take place, since, notwithstanding their losses, the followers of the sealing master were still a majority of the ship's company? This question, I could clearly see, was occupying the thoughts of Captain Len Guy and West. Again, although the recruits from the Falklands formed only a total of 14 men, as against the 12 of the old crew, was it not to be feared that some of the latter would take Hearne's side? What if Hearne's people, urged by despair, were already thinking of seizing the only boat we now possessed, setting off towards the north, and leaving us on this iceberg? It was, then, of great importance that our boat should be put in safety and closely watched. A marked change had taken place in Captain Len Guy since the recent occurrences. He seemed to be transformed upon finding himself face to face with the dangers which menaced us. Up to that time he had been solely occupied in searching for his fellow countrymen. He had handed over the command of the schooner to West, and he could not have given it to anyone more zealous and more capable. But from this date, he resumed his position as master of the ship, and used it with the energy required by the circumstances. In a word, he again became sole master on board, after God. At his command the crew were drawn up around him on a flat spot a little to the left of the Halbrane. In that place the following were assembled. On the senior side, Martin Holt and Hardy, Rogers, Francis, Gratian, Barry, Stern, the cook and Dickott, and I may add Dirk Peters. On the side of the newcomers, Hearne and the 13 other Falkland sailors. The latter composed a distinct group. The sealing master was their spokesman and exercised a baneful influence over them. Captain Len Guy cast a stern glance upon the men, and said in a sharp tone, "Sailors of the Halbrane, I must first speak to you of our lost companions. 5 of us have just perished in this catastrophe. We are waiting to perish in our turn, in these seas, where we have been dragged in spite of." "Be silent, Hearne," cried West, pale with anger, "or if not." "Hearne has said what he had to say," Captain Len Guy continued coldly. "Now it is said, and I advise him not to interrupt me a second time." The sealing master might possibly have ventured on an answer, for he felt that he was backed by the majority of the crew, but Martin Holt held him back, and he was silent. Captain Len Guy then took off his hat and pronounced the following words with an emotion that affected us to the bottom of our hearts. "We must pray for those who have died in this dangerous voyage, which was undertaken in the name of humanity. May God be pleased to take into consideration the fact that they devoted their lives to their fellow creatures, and may he not be insensible to our prayers. Kneel down, sailors of the Halbrane." They all knelt down on the icy surface, and the murmurs of prayer ascended towards heaven. We waited for Captain Len Guy to rise before we did so. "Now," he resumed, "after those who are dead come those who have survived. To them I say that they must obey me, whatever my orders may be, and even in our present situation I shall not tolerate any hesitation or opposition. The responsibility for the general safety is mine, and I will not yield any of it to anyone. I am master here, as on board." "On board, when there is no longer a ship," muttered the sealing master. "You are mistaken, Hearne, the vessel is there, and we will put it back into the sea. Besides, if we had only a boat, I am the captain of it. Let him beware who forgets this." That day, Captain Len Guy, having taken the height of the sun by the sextant, and fixed the hour by the chronometer, both of these instruments had escaped destruction in the collision, obtained the following position of his ship. South latitude, 88 degrees 55 letter 2B9. West longitude, 39 degrees 12 letter 2B9. The Halbrane was only at 1 degrees 5 letter 2B9, about 65 miles from the South Pole. "All hands to work," was the captain's order that afternoon, and everyone obeyed it with a will. There was not a moment to lose, as the question of time was more important than any other. So far as provisions were concerned, there was enough in the schooner for 18 months on full rations, so we were not threatened with hunger, nor with thirst either, notwithstanding that owing to the water casks having been burst in the collision, their contents had escaped through their staves. Luckily, the barrels of gin, whiskey, beer, and wine, being placed in the least exposed part of the hold, were nearly all intact. Under this head we had experienced no loss, and the iceberg would supply us with good drinking water. It is a well-known fact that ice, whether formed from fresh or salt water, contains no salt, owing to the chloride of sodium being eliminated in the change from the liquid to the solid state. The origin of the ice, therefore, is a matter of no importance. However, those blocks which are easily distinguished by their greenish color and their perfect transparency are preferable. They are solidified rain, and therefore much more suitable for drinking water. Without doubt, our captain would have recognized any blocks of this description, but none were to be found on the glacier, owing to its being that part of the berg which was originally submerged and came to the top after the fall. The captain and West decided first to lighten the vessel by conveying everything on board to land. The masts were to be cleared of rigging, taken out, and placed on the plateau. It was necessary to lighten the vessel as much as possible, even to clear out the ballast, owing to the difficult and dangerous operation of launching. It would be better to put off our departure for some days if this operation could be performed under more favorable circumstances. The loading might be afterwards accomplished without much difficulty. Besides this, another reason by no means less serious presented itself to us. It would have been an act of unpardonable rashness to leave the provisions in the storeroom of the Halbrane, her situation on the side of the iceberg being very precarious. One shake would suffice to detach the ship, and with her would have disappeared the supplies on which our lives depended. On this account, we passed the day in removing casks of half-salted meat, dried vegetables, flour, biscuits, tea, coffee, barrels of gin, whiskey, wine and beer from the hold and storeroom, and placing them in safety in the hammocks near the Halbrane. We also had to ensure our landing against any possible accident, and, I must add, against any plot on the part of Hearne and others to seize the boat in order to return to the ice barrier. We placed the longboat in a cavity which would be easy to watch, about 30 feet to the left of the schooner, along with its oars, rudder, compass, anchor, masts, and sail. By day there was nothing to fear, and at night, or rather during the hours of sleep, the boatswain and one of the superiors would keep guard near the cavity, and we might rest assured that no evil could befall. The 19th, 20th, and of January were passed in working extra hard in the unshipping of the cargo and the dismantling of the Halbrane. We slung the lower masts by means of yards forming props. Later on, West would see to replacing the main and mizzen masts. In any case, we could do without them until we had reached the Falklands or some other winter port. Needless to say, we had set up a camp on the plateau of which I have spoken, not far from the Halbrane. Sufficient shelter against the inclemency of the weather, not unfrequent at this time of the year, was to be found under tents, constructed of sails placed on spars and fastened down by pegs. The glass remained set fair. The wind was northeast, the temperature having risen to 46 degrees, 2 degrees 78 letter 2b9c. Endicott's kitchen was fitted up at the end of the plain, near a steep projection by which we could climb to the very top of the berg. It is only fair to state that during these 3 days of hard work, no fault was to be found with Hearne. The sealing master knew he was being closely watched, and he was well aware that Captain Len Guy would not spare him if he tried to get up insubordination amongst his comrades. It was a pity that his bad instincts had induced him to play such a part, for his strength, skill, and cleverness made him a very valuable man, and he had never proved more useful than under these circumstances. Was he changed for the better? Did he understand that general good feeling was necessary for the safety of all? I know not, but I had no confidence in him, neither had Her Legerly. I need not dwell on the ardor with which the half-breed did the rough work, always first to begin and the last to leave off, doing as much as 4 men, and scarcely sleeping, only resting during meals, which he took apart from the others. He had hardly spoken to me at all since the schooner had met with this terrible accident. What indeed could he say to me? Did I not know as well as he that it would be necessary to renounce every hope of pursuing our intended voyage? Now and again, I noticed Martin Holt and the half-breed near each other while some difficult piece of work was in progress. Our sailing master did not miss a chance of getting near Dirk Peters, who always tried his best to escape from him, for reasons well known to me. And whenever I thought of the secret of the fate of the so-called Parker, Martin Holt's brother, which had been entrusted to me, that dreadful scene of the Grampus filled me with horror. I was certain that if this secret were made known, the half-breed would become an object of terror. He would no longer be looked upon as the rescuer of the sailing master, and the latter, learning that his brother, luckily, Dirk Peters and myself were the only 2 acquainted with the fact. While the Halbrane was being unloaded, Captain Len Guy and the mate were considering how the vessel might be launched. They had to allow for a drop of 100 feet between the cavity in which the ship lay and the sea, this to be effected by means of an inclined bed, hollowed in an oblique line along the west side of the iceberg, and to measure 200 or 300 perches in length. So, while the first lot of men, commanded by the boatswain, was unloading the schooner, a second batch under West's orders began to cut the trench between the blocks which covered the side of the floating mountain. Floating, I know not why I use this expression, for the iceberg no longer floated, but remained as motionless as an island. There was nothing to indicate that it would ever move again. Other icebergs drifted along and past us, going southeast, whilst ours, to use Dirk Peters' expression, was lying to. Would its base be sufficiently undermined to allow it to detach itself? Perhaps some heavy mass of ice might strike it and set it free by the shock. No one could predict such an event, and we had only the halbrane to rely upon for getting us out of these regions.